Most people believe they know the Vatican. They picture the magnificent dome of St. Peter's Basilica rising above Rome, the colorful uniforms of the Swiss guards standing watch at its gates, and crowds of pilgrims filling St. Peter's Square beneath the Sunday sun. Millions of visitors travel there every year believing they are simply visiting the headquarters of the Catholic Church. But behind those ancient walls lies a story that stretches back nearly 2,000 years, a story filled with emperors, persecution, hidden passageways, political intrigue, extraordinary acts of faith, and moments that quietly changed the course of world history. The Vatican is not simply the world's smallest independent country. It is one of the oldest surviving centers of influence on Earth. Every stone beneath its streets has witnessed centuries of triumph, tragedy, sacrifice, and survival. Yet much of this remarkable history is rarely taught in classrooms, and many of its most fascinating chapters remain unknown to the average visitor. Long before grand basilicas, magnificent palaces, or towering Renaissance masterpieces stood on Vatican Hill, this area looked completely different. Nearly 2,000 years ago, it lay just outside the city of ancient Rome. It was considered an ordinary hillside, separated from the bustling heart of the empire by the Tiber River. Few people imagined that this quiet piece of land would one day become one of the most sacred places in Christianity. During the reign of Emperor Nero in the 1st century, however, the hill gained a far darker reputation. Nero had constructed an enormous entertainment complex known as the Circus of Nero, where chariot races, public spectacles, and brutal executions entertained Roman crowds. Following the devastating Great Fire of Rome in AD 64, Nero searched desperately for someone to blame. Rather than accepting responsibility himself, he accused the growing Christian community of starting the disaster. A wave of persecution quickly followed. Thousands of Christians were arrested, tortured, and executed in horrifying ways designed to frighten anyone who dared embrace the new faith. Among those captured was a fisherman from Galilee whose life had already transformed history. His name was Simon Peter, one of the closest followers of Jesus Christ. According to ancient Christian tradition, Peter was brought to Rome during Nero's persecution and sentenced to death. Unlike many others, Peter made one final request before his execution. Feeling unworthy to die in the same manner as Jesus, he asked to be crucified upside down. Roman soldiers carried out his request near the Circus of Nero, on the very hillside that would centuries later become Vatican City. After his death, fellow Christians quietly buried his body in a nearby cemetery. At the time, it appeared to be nothing more than a simple grave among many others. No monuments marked the place. No grand church stood above it. Only a small group of believers remembered where their spiritual leader had been laid to rest. Yet that humble burial site would eventually become one of the most important locations in Christian history. For nearly 300 years, Christianity remained an outlawed religion throughout much of the Roman Empire. Believers gathered secretly inside homes, underground burial chambers known as catacombs, and hidden places where they could worship without fear of arrest. Despite repeated attempts by Roman authorities to eliminate Christianity, the faith continued spreading from city to city with astonishing speed. Every persecution seemed only to strengthen the determination of those who believed. The story of Peter's sacrifice inspired countless Christians, many of whom willingly accepted imprisonment or death rather than abandon their faith. Few could have imagined that the same empire attempting to destroy Christianity would one day embrace it completely. Everything changed during the early 4th century when Emperor Constantine emerged as the most powerful ruler in the Roman world. According to historical accounts, before a decisive military battle in AD 312, Constantine experienced a vision that forever changed his life. He claimed to have seen a cross in the sky, accompanied by words promising victory through the Christian symbol. After winning the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine dramatically altered imperial policy toward Christianity. In AD 313, he and Emperor Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious freedom throughout the empire and ending generations of official persecution. Christians were finally free to worship openly. Churches could now be built without fear of destruction, and Christian leaders no longer lived in hiding. It marked one of the greatest turning points in religious history. Soon afterward, Constantine made an extraordinary decision. Rather than constructing a magnificent church in the center of Rome, he ordered builders to erect an enormous basilica directly above what Christians believed to be the burial place of St. Peter. Engineers faced enormous challenges. The hillside had to be leveled, ancient tombs carefully protected or relocated, and massive foundations constructed over uneven ground. The project required years of labor and enormous financial resources, but Constantine believed the effort honored the man whom Christians regarded as the first leader of the church. The basilica transformed the once-forgotten hillside into one of Christianity's holiest destinations. Pilgrims began traveling from every corner of the Roman Empire to pray near Peter's tomb. Roads leading toward Rome grew busier each year, carrying merchants, bishops, monks, nobles, and ordinary believers, seeking spiritual comfort at the place where history, faith, and sacrifice had become permanently intertwined. As Christianity continued to spread across Europe, the importance of the Vatican grew far beyond a single church built over the tomb of St. Peter. It gradually became the spiritual heart of a faith that was transforming the ancient world. But history rarely moves in a straight line. Just as Christianity was beginning to flourish, the Roman Empire itself started to crumble. During the 5th century, waves of barbarian invasions swept across Europe. Once mighty Roman legions struggled to defend the empire's borders, as Goths, Vandals, and Huns pushed deeper into Roman territory. Cities that had stood proudly for centuries fell into chaos, trade routes disappeared, and political authority weakened year after year. In AD 476, the Western Roman Empire officially collapsed, marking the end of an era that had lasted for hundreds of years. Many believed civilization itself was coming to an end. Amid that uncertainty, one institution remained standing. And while emperors disappeared and governments collapsed, the church continued to provide stability for ordinary people. The bishops of Rome gradually became more than religious leaders. They settled disputes between communities, distributed food to the poor, organized relief during famines, negotiated with invading armies, and protected countless families caught in the violence surrounding them. At a time when political leaders often failed, many people began looking to the Pope for guidance and security. Without conquering kingdoms or commanding great armies, the Vatican slowly became one of the most respected centers of leadership in Europe. One of the most remarkable moments came during the 5th century when Pope Leo III, later known as Leo the Great, confronted Attila the Hun. Attila's armies had devastated much of Europe and were advancing toward Italy, leaving fear in every town they approached. Historical records tell us that instead of sending soldiers, Pope Leo personally traveled to meet the feared conqueror. Exactly what happened during that meeting remains one of history's great mysteries. Some accounts suggest diplomacy changed Attila's mind, while later traditions describe a powerful spiritual experience. Whatever the reason, Attila unexpectedly turned his army away from Rome. The city was spared, and the event dramatically strengthened the Pope's reputation throughout Europe. People increasingly viewed the Bishop of Rome not only as a religious figure, but also as someone capable of influencing the course of history itself. As centuries passed, pilgrims continued arriving in Rome from every corner of Europe. The journey was often dangerous. Travelers crossed mountains, dense forests, and regions plagued by bandits, disease, and war. Some spent months walking thousands of miles simply to pray at St. Peter's tomb. Many never completed the journey, yet countless others believed the risks were worthwhile. Small villages along pilgrimage routes slowly developed into thriving towns filled with inns, marketplaces, monasteries, and hospitals, established to care for weary travelers. The Vatican became a destination unlike any other, drawing kings, peasants, scholars, and monks together for the same purpose. It was one of the few places where people from completely different cultures could stand side by side, united by a shared faith. During the Middle Ages, another extraordinary transformation began to take place. The Vatican was no longer only a spiritual center. It also became one of Europe's greatest guardians of knowledge. Across the continent, wars destroyed cities and libraries vanished in flames. Ancient books disappeared forever as kingdoms rose and fell. Yet inside monasteries connected to the church, dedicated monks spent countless hours carefully copying manuscripts by hand. Every page required patience, precision, and remarkable concentration. They preserved not only religious writings, but also works by ancient Greek and Roman philosophers, historians, scientists, and poets. Without those handwritten copies, much of classical civilization might have been lost forever. While battles raged outside monastery walls, quiet rooms filled with candlelight became places where history itself was being protected one page at a time. The Vatican also became one of the greatest patrons of education in medieval Europe. Cathedral schools expanded into universities where theology, philosophy, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and law were studied. Long before modern educational systems existed, scholars traveled across Europe seeking knowledge from institutions supported by the Church. Although medieval life is often remembered as an age of darkness, it was also a period when learning quietly survived because thousands of priests, monks, and scholars believed that preserving knowledge honored both God and humanity. As the influence of the papacy continued to grow, magnificent churches and administrative buildings gradually surrounded St. Peter's Basilica. Workshops, residences, libraries, and meeting halls transformed the once empty hillside into a bustling religious center. Yet, despite its growing importance, the Vatican of the Middle Ages looked very different from the one visitors see today. The enormous Renaissance Basilica had not yet been built. The famous dome designed by Michelangelo did not exist. The grand square welcoming millions of tourists every year was still centuries away. Instead, pilgrims entered a far simpler complex, one that reflected the humility of Christianity's earliest generations, even as the Church itself expanded across continents. By the beginning of the Renaissance, Europe was entering a new age of exploration, discovery, and artistic achievement. Popes increasingly recognized that beauty itself could become an expression of faith. Rather than constructing ordinary buildings, they invited the greatest architects, painters, and sculptors of their generation to transform the Vatican into a masterpiece, unlike anything the world had ever seen. Names such as Bramante, Raphael, Bernini, and Michelangelo would forever become linked with Vatican history. Their work would not simply decorate churches, it would create some of humanity's greatest artistic treasures. But behind every magnificent painting, towering sculpture, and breathtaking chapel stood a fascinating story filled with ambition, rivalry, sacrifice, and extraordinary vision. And those remarkable stories would shape the Vatican for centuries to come. By the early 1500s, the Vatican had become one of the most influential places in the world. Kings sought its approval before making major decisions. Powerful rulers sent ambassadors to Rome hoping to gain the Pope's support, while artists, scholars, and architects dreamed of leaving their mark on the heart of Christianity. Yet behind the beauty of its churches and the growing influence of the papacy, the Vatican faced one of the greatest challenges in its history. Europe was changing rapidly. New ideas were spreading, printing presses were making information available faster than ever before, and many believers had begun questioning practices within the Church. What followed would reshape Christianity forever. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther challenged several teachings and practices that he believed needed reform. His written objections quickly spread across Europe, helped by the newly invented printing press. Within months, debates that once remained inside monasteries had reached ordinary people in towns and villages. What began as a call for reform eventually developed into the Protestant Reformation, creating one of the biggest religious divisions in Christian history. The Vatican suddenly faced a crisis unlike any it had experienced before. Entire regions separated from the authority of Rome, and the unity that had existed for centuries began to fracture. Rather than ignoring the situation, church leaders recognized that change was necessary. In response, the Catholic Church launched what historians now call the Counter-Reformation. One of its most important moments came with the Council of Trent, a series of meetings held between 1545 and 1563. Bishops and theologians from across Europe gathered to clarify church teachings, address corruption, improve the education of priests, and strengthen discipline within the church. Although these discussions were often difficult and lasted nearly 2 decades, they reshaped Catholic life for centuries to come. Many traditions, educational standards, and liturgical practices that Catholics recognize today trace their origins back to those historic meetings. The Vatican emerged from the crisis determined not only to defend its beliefs, but also to renew itself from within. At the same time, another extraordinary project was transforming the skyline of Rome. The original Basilica of St. Peter, built by Emperor Constantine more than 1,000 years earlier, had begun to deteriorate. Engineers warned that parts of the ancient structure were becoming unstable. Rather than repairing it piece by piece, Pope Julius II made a bold decision. He ordered the construction of an entirely new basilica, one that would become the largest church in the Christian world. It was an ambitious undertaking, unlike anything Europe had ever attempted. Thousands of workers, architects, engineers, stonecutters, and craftsmen devoted generations of their lives to the project. Construction would continue for more than 120 years before the magnificent building was finally completed. Among the many artists invited to contribute was Michelangelo Buonarroti, already famous throughout Italy for his sculptures and paintings. Although he considered himself primarily a sculptor, Pope Julius II commissioned him to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. At first, Michelangelo resisted the assignment. He believed others were better suited for the work and worried that accepting such an enormous project might damage his reputation. Eventually, he agreed, unaware that he was about to create one of history's greatest artistic masterpieces. For nearly 4 years, he worked high above the chapel floor on towering scaffolding, often painting for hours while lying on his back. The physical strain was immense. Paint frequently dripped into his eyes, his neck remained bent for long periods, and exhaustion became part of his daily routine. Yet despite those hardships, Michelangelo completed more than 300 breathtaking figures across the ceiling, illustrating scenes from the book of Genesis, including the famous image of God's hand reaching toward Adam. More than 500 years later, millions continue traveling to the Vatican simply to stand beneath that remarkable work of art. Only a few decades later, Michelangelo returned once again to paint the chapel's massive altar wall with his dramatic masterpiece, The Last Judgment. Covering hundreds of square meters, the painting depicts Christ's second coming, the resurrection of the dead, and the final judgment of humanity. Every detail reflected Michelangelo's extraordinary skill and deep understanding of Scripture. Visitors entering the Sistine Chapel today often find themselves looking upward in complete silence, overwhelmed by the scale, beauty, and emotional power of the artwork surrounding them. Few realize that these masterpieces were created during one of the most turbulent periods in church history, when the Vatican itself was fighting to preserve unity across Europe. While artists transformed the Vatican into one of the world's greatest cultural treasures, another group quietly became responsible for protecting it. In 1506, Pope Julius II officially welcomed the first members of the Swiss Guard into Vatican service. Recruited from Switzerland, these soldiers earned a reputation throughout Europe for discipline, courage, and loyalty. Their mission was simple yet profound: defend the Pope with their lives if necessary. Over the centuries, that promise has never changed. Every Swiss Guard still takes an oath pledging complete loyalty to the Holy Father. Their colorful Renaissance uniforms attract countless tourists each day, but behind those famous blue, red, and yellow garments stand highly trained professionals who undergo rigorous military preparation before earning the privilege of serving inside Vatican City. One of the Swiss Guard's greatest moments came during the sack of Rome in 1527. Troops loyal to Emperor Charles V stormed the city, bringing violence and destruction unlike anything Rome had experienced in centuries. As enemy soldiers approached the Vatican, 189 Swiss Guards formed a defensive line on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. They fought bravely against overwhelming numbers, buying precious time for Pope Clement VII to escape through a hidden elevated passage known as the Passetto di Borgo. This secret corridor connected the Vatican directly to Castel Sant'Angelo, allowing the Pope to reach safety while the guards held their ground. Nearly all of them lost their lives defending the Holy Father, but their sacrifice ensured his survival. Even today, new members of the Swiss Guard are sworn into service on May 6th each year, commemorating the courage of those who gave everything during that unforgettable battle. As the Renaissance reached its height, the Vatican had become far more than a religious center. It stood at the crossroads of faith, politics, diplomacy, education, science, and art. Its libraries preserved priceless knowledge. Its chapels displayed masterpieces admired around the world, and its influence extended far beyond the borders of Italy. Yet perhaps the greatest mystery of all remained hidden behind doors that very few people would ever enter: a collection of ancient manuscripts, royal letters, scientific records, diplomatic correspondence, and historical documents that would one day become known as one of the most fascinating archives on Earth. For centuries, these records have inspired endless curiosity, countless myths, and extraordinary speculation. But the true story behind the Vatican archives is even more remarkable than most people imagine.